Wherever you are, welcome to another part in the 5-part series of perceived threats from China. Previously, we talked about the Hong Kong issues and the human rights allegations. This time, we're looking at the military buildup. In case you missed the introduction to this series, there are 4 major threats from China. All are perceived rather than real. All are amplified by misunderstandings and/or misinterpretations, and all can be explained in a different way, but no one appears to have bothered to do that. No one has talked to anyone in government, diplomatic or political arena with a sense of balance. We've never considered the other side of the debate, the side that says they might be wrong. Instead, we accept the threats must be real, but they are not. The 4 major threats that we're talking about, the Western world perceives from China, are human rights abuses in Xinjiang, the removal of democratic rights in Hong Kong, and I've made both of those videos and posted them, an aggressive military build-up, which is this one, and the imminent invasion of Taiwan. There's an alternative for all of them. Let's take a closer look at China's military build-up, or as it's sometimes called, China's military expansion. This is a highly subjective matter, since there's no doubt that China has built up a military presence. But from a Chinese perspective, there's also no doubt that it's necessary. Indeed, China has built the largest navy in the world. The People's Liberation Army Navy has more ships, but less tonnage than the USA. The USA has 11 carrier strike groups. China has 2, with 1 more on the way. But experts believe China has 355 ships now and will soon build up to 480, and this must surely be a worry for any potential enemies. However, the USA has military bases in Japan, Korea, the Philippines. It's building more. There are all China's neighbors. China has no military bases overseas other than Djibouti, where it has worked with the USA on countering piracy in the region. The US also has military bases in other parts of the Pacific. They occupy 30% of the country of Guam. They're expanding in Australia as well as building more on Nauru and Papua New Guinea. In fact, the USA has more than 750 military bases around the world that they admit to, but many more they don't admit to, including one in Taiwan, where it was recently discovered, denied, and then admitted that they do actually have troops. China quite rightly feels the need to protect the sovereignty of its borders. It's threatened on a daily basis by the world's most aggressive country. And it does this by building what even the US experts admit is a defensive military capability. China has a 9-dash line where it claims control over the waters and islands, which was accepted by the USA when the Republic of China's 11-dash line claimed the same, or more. The USA could be asked to comment on why this was acceptable to them when they agreed to the 1943 Cairo Declaration, and it's no longer acceptable. What's changed other than their recognition in 1971 of a different party and a different form of governance? A governance that the people of China fought for, not one that was imposed upon them. People will then erroneously argue that the 9-dash line is in breach of UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and they would be wrong again. Because they've been misinformed and misled by media, which states that the tribunal, which was formed to examine information but had no basis to make rulings, has said this is true. Surprisingly, considering all the rhetoric, China has not actually militarized the South China Sea. Li Keqiang said this in 2017, and despite what many in the West might believe, when a premier of China says something, it will be found to be true. Western media reports constantly suggest it, but there is no evidence. Now, if you doubt this fact, go find a photo or a video of a military installation in the region. What you will find are a couple of airstrips. Not one of them will show a military aircraft on it, with the exception of one event many years ago when a military craft landed to take 2 injured workers off the island. And this event was so exceptional, it made international headlines in 2016. And there you have it. The truth about China's militarization of the South China Seas is misinformation. They're not doing it. The United States has over 79,000 troops in Japan and Korea alone, and it admits in its own military media that the purpose is to overshadow China. The US also has a history of invasions, wars, occupations, and regime changes. Afghanistan borders China and was invaded by the USA. Korea borders China and was invaded by the USA. Vietnam borders China and was invaded by the USA. The Philippines share a sea border with China and were invaded by the USA. The USA currently, as well as all of the bases it has, sails 2 carrier strike groups, the Reagan and the Vinson, in the Pacific region. A carrier strike group consists of the carrier and 4 to 6 other ships, as well as an undisclosed number of submarines, with a total number of crew of around 7,000 to counter China. Moving away from the US current position, let's look at some history. Mongolia borders China, and that was occupied by Soviet Russia. Parts of China's northeast, Dongbei, were invaded and occupied by Russians and then the Japanese. Burma borders China and was invaded by the British and the Japanese, as was India, the British anyway, which as a result of that colonization by the British still has border disputes with China. If China didn't have a strong defensive force, it's likely that many of those incursions in neighboring countries would have spread into China. Throughout all of these sovereign invasions, China's neighbors, China has been guilty of only one 27-day incursion in 1979 into Vietnam. And something the world seems to forget is that when China invaded Vietnam, it was with the, quote, moral support, diplomatic backing, and intelligence cooperation of the USA. That invasion was out of character for China and clearly not done in a vacuum. Kissinger and Nixon both wanted Deng Xiaoping to do this. China itself was invaded by the USA and another 7 nations in and around the Opium War. During this same era of weakness, the ending of the Qing dynasty, when China didn't have a strong military defense, it lost parts of Tibet to the British Empire, all of Mongolia to independence-seeking warlords who were eventually annexed by the Soviet Union, and parts of Dongbei to both Russia on a permanent basis and Japan. And while this was going on, the UK had also taken Hong Kong. Germans took parts of Shandong. The USA, French, British, and many others were in Shanghai, and even parts of Guangzhou, Wuhan, Tianjin, and many other cities, which were being operated as foreign concessions or treaty ports. This is really bad for Chinese people. Chinese people weren't allowed entry into these concessions or treaty ports, and if they were permitted, they were subject to racist and exploitative laws, and sometimes subject to slave-like and abusive working conditions, including children being chained to machines where they lived, ate, slept, and worked. There's even a word in English for this practice, the practice of kidnapping and exploiting workers into slavery. If it happens to you, you've been shanghaied. We still say that. China was invaded by Japan in 1937. Its world war was longer and more ferocious, with more brutality and war crimes than even the European war was. After 1949, when the communists took power, China's new government promised the people that this humiliation will never happen again. And in order to ensure that it doesn't, they've built the largest and most powerful defensive force in history. That same defensive force is the largest supplier of manpower to the United Nations peacekeepers. And for more details about this, it would be important to consider the 2020 White Paper on Peacekeeping, where China confirmed its stance on defense and peace rather than aggression. The People's Liberation Army is loved by the people of China. Being accepted into the Chinese military is hard for young people. China, with a history of being invaded, is surrounded by an aggressive and hostile military encirclement, but absolutely no history or record of being an invader, and is still accused of aggression by the world's most aggressive country. A country that has actually invaded 68 other countries, including China, most of them without a declaration of war. But here's what's most terrifying about US aggression. If we were to look at the number of countries where the USA has been involved in some military action by putting boots on the ground, that number is much higher. In fact, it's every country in the world except 3: Andorra, Bhutan, and Liechtenstein. Right now, the US military has 120 military bases in Asia, 29 in Africa. Yet somehow, the Western world is being convinced by media misinformation that the US is a worthy partner in pursuit of peace, and China is the aggressor. Join me again in the next episode where we'll talk about the most important one, the supposedly imminent invasion of Taiwan. Look forward to seeing you then. Bye for now.